Podcast. Artificial intelligence news, research and thoughts from leading AI minds, researchers, and enthusiasts. With host Tennisha Martin. This is a show where we discuss artificial intelligence at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, education, and society. We're going to let you finish, but Tennisha's got thoughts.
What's up? We are back with another episode of AI Thoughts Online. I'm the host, Tennisha Martin, and I'm excited because we have the incomparable Mr. O'Shea Bowens here with us today. What's going on?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So introduce yourself to the folks that do not know you so far.
Yeah, sure. O'Shea Bowens, or Obi-Wan. I've been in InfoSec for about 14, 15 years professionally. Like, I was one of those people that kind of developed like an interest in hacking and the hacking scene around the time I was like 13. Actually, it sounds like a storyline, but when I was actually like in sixth grade, we had like a computer class, and I went to school in Dallas, like that's where I'm originally from, even though I live on the East Coast. But we had like electives because it was year-round school. So you don't take a summer, you take a couple weeks at a time and like increments off during the year. But one of the classes was like a computer class, and we were playing like different, like we're like Snake and like a bunch like Sierra Online and things like that. And one of the teachers was really, I credit him a lot. He was really cool. Like he began to show us like what HTML looked like, kind of like what C looked like. This was like, early, late 90s, something like that. And then that same summer while this was going on, while I was in my first computer club in like a lab, my good friend Sam, who I spent most of my time with, his mom had bought a movie. And, the normal pattern was, school, we walk home together, we hang out, play like N64, play like Star Fox, if anybody remembers that game, play like N64. And he's like, oh, my mom bought this movie Hackers. She said we might like it. So I saw Hackers like in sixth grade. And then that was like kind of like started everything for me. It was just like, I thought that was just like, it still is an incredible movie, but for me, it had a pretty big impact because I was just at that age where, you're learning to you're learning about computers, about different technologies. And then I saw Hackers, and I thought like, wait, it was like that moment of like, it's like Hollywood stuff, or can you actually do some of these things, like connect to systems and shut things down? Like, it was just like mind blowing. And then as I got deeper into, like, at this time it was AOL led me to bulletin boards led me to IRC, and then slowly started picking up things, maybe dumb things I shouldn't have done, but started picking up, started to learn things. So that's what kind of led me down my path to security. And in those 14 years, I mostly operate on the defensive side. So it's mostly been pretty much, typical story. You start at the SOC, right? Junior analyst, or whatever. But I had kind of a networking background because I had started learning about networking and routers and switches. because I dropped out of school like when I was 20 to go work at a startup, and I was doing everything IT wise. So I was setting up the servers, running the website. As the company grew, they were a small defense contractor, so I started handling onboarding clients, like third-party clients, also setting up the laptops for people, and then running servers and switches and routers. So that was kind of like, I had some of the hacking background, I guess you could say, quote unquote. I had like the hacking knowledge at that point. But I was going to school for CS anyway, and they offered me a job. So I was 20. I didn't want to find myself in a position where I had like mad student debt and student loans. So I took the job, and then, so by the time from 20 till now, I've been, professionally working. And then about a year or two after the defense contractor got bought, I ended up going into DOD and doing cyber work there around like 22, 23, and pretty much spend most of my time around like, the blue team, I call it the blue team spear, right? So it's not just forensics, but focusing on IR, security analytics, monitoring detection, a lot of focus the last like 8 years on cloud. So it's been a fun ride. Like I enjoy the technical side. I enjoy my professional side, but then things like this, getting to talk to you, that's like, the big thing. That's like one of the bigger things to me. Like, how do we network? How do we meet more people, especially people of color? Like, how do we find more of us? How do we promote each other? Right. Like that's super important to me. So I spend a lot of time volunteering, and I mean, what's how we met, traveling, speaking at conferences or whatnot, like usually traveling, speaking, things like that.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely amazing because, I am more on the offensive side of the world. So I am super interested in some of your perspectives as far as like the impact of AI specifically on InfoSec from a defensive perspective. So what does that look like? What are some of the things that you're seeing from a defensive perspective as it relates to artificial intelligence?
So I think so. You kind of have to start at the beginning, right? Like I feel like we're in this space. So do you remember like almost maybe 7 or 8 years ago, right? Like around the time people started integrating like SIMs and EDRs, and there was this whole just word soup of, hey, if you don't have a SIM, number one, you're behind. If you don't have EDR, you're definitely behind. If your SIM and EDR can't correlate, there's no pipelines, you're not even really in the ball game, right? Like you're just ripe for attack. And so in some ways that's totally true. But I feel like the conversation shifted to AI in the last year or two, kind of in that same bubble. The key difference here is I don't think a lot of people are approaching it from a perspective of understanding it as a fad or checklist item, right? So by fad, I mean, is this something that will teeter away down the line? The answer is no, in my opinion, no. And then also from a checklist side of things, and I think this is the bigger struggle when it comes to cyber defense or cyber operations, or just running a security program. Because most of the last 8 years, I've come in like startups and helped them build out the security practice from the ground up, right? So it's one of these things of how do you bake AI into the security practice? And we're still answering that question, right? Like I don't know anyone I know a lot of people. I don't know anyone that can come in and say, hey, you need this, this, and this, right? So I think the thing to kind of focus on from a defensive side of things is, do you have basic like data engineering, right? Like that's kind of number one stepping stone, right? Do you have a way to correlate all relative data within your environment, right? And when we ask that question, a lot of times we're thinking about it from a SIM perspective, right? Do we have logs that we can forward over into a SIM, use that for alerting, use that for monitoring, type of correlation there. The gap, I think, this is just cybersecurity in general, is really us taking a step to really answer the question of, what is AI, right? Like I think, and I'll this is just O'Shea's interpretation. I'm not an MIT, like I'm not an MIT professor. I teach, but I don't teach, AI. But I think the best place to do is start from the beginning, right? So when you think about, AI as, what does AI encompass, or what is AI, right? Like AI has been around for since really the 1950s, 1953, 1954, something like that, right? Like you can think all the way back to like Alan Turing, like creating the first computer, and the idea was he wanted to have that speak as or act as a human's brain, right? Naturally he didn't have the technology advances that we have now, but that was the idea, right? How do you simulate? How do you create a machine that can simulate the human brain, the human thinking patterns, right? So when I think about AI, like this goes back pretty far, but now we're at a stage of what layers into the AI that we know nowadays, right? So you have AI, then you have machine learning, right? So machine learning, second stage in regards to essentially like how do you provide different data, but also thinking about it from a perspective of like there's no rules that you're telling this data to essentially abide by. Everyone likely remembers maybe I want to say 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago when there were all these snippets that were going around online about someone playing a computer in chess and the computer actually went right. So that were machine learning, like you're feeding the system like a set of rules, the rules being data, but just feeding the machine a set of rules that it likely learns, applies, and acts on. So chess is super instructional, right? Like your knight two goes to queen, things like that. Like you can kind of teach a computer the basics, the rules, and then allow it to work out different computations or different steps in regards to like chess. So AI, machine learning, then deep learning. Deep learning meaning essentially in simple terms, there are no rules, right? You feed it the data and you let it sort it out for itself, right? Maybe that's based on predictive models that were available kind of from the machine learning side of things, or maybe it's just you have a lot of data, you want to just dump it on there, dump it to the system and allow it to sort out what is what by using associative tags and it learning on its own, right? And then we kind of then we go to the phase of generative AI, right? Like this is where we are right now. Like everyone here is like, generative AI, like what does that mean? What is that? And think about it from a perspective of like, hey, you use ChatGPT. I using ChatGPT around 3.0. I think it was like 3.0 is when I starting to learn on my own, like the basic of ChatGPT. And that generative AI stages is basically the ability to, can you create music, right? Can you create videos, right? And it's awesome. You're starting to see a lot of things around from our world, right, from a security perspective, deep fakes, phishing attempts, and things along those lines, right? And all of this is built upon LLM, large language models, and that's essentially the type of AI, the type of text-based information that you're feeding into a system, right? So why do I go give the whole circle, right? I think it's important that everyone kind of understands the stages, and then now we can kind of speak about what it means from a security perspective. And the way I look at it is in my world, I mostly operate on defense. That's been, 14 years of my life is understanding how attackers work, how they think. That's what I did for government, analyzing attacks from nation states and then breaking down their tools, feeding that over into the intel pipeline, and then creating that circle communication. When you think about it from a defensive side now, you have to first look at how it's being leveraged by attackers, right? So you think about things like, I think the things that come to mind is like, Terminator Skynet, like it's going to take over our lives, right? I mean, maybe that will happen. I don't know. This totally could happen. We could be 60 or 70, 20, 30 years from now. I'm like, damn, we were wrong. Like it really has enslaved us.
We should have been worried.
Yeah, right. We shouldn't have fed it so much, right? But what I look at is like, how are attackers leveraging it, right? Like the top area that I see, again, this is O'Shea Bowens. This is just what I've seen from my own research, speaking to a lot of my peers and kind of being in different rooms, different forums and things like that. You're mostly seeing it being operated from a phishing perspective, right? So what does that mean, right? When we think about like, the traditional phishing methods, like you're in offense, like you understand how it works. Like you need to create a template, have a template and create something that looks as realistic as possible for the human brain to associate with like it being legitimate, right? Like I see this email from Bank of America. It looks like, I need to reset my password. Looks legit. It has a BOA, it has a BOA URL link. So it looks like what I would normally get, and then you click it, and attackers make away with your password, right? That's kind of the current model for phishing. Make it look as realistic as possible, right? But that current model has a lot of deficiencies. Attackers aren't really able to quickly regroup. I mean, when I mean regroup is, we share a lot of intel nowadays, right? So phishing emails, phishing URLs, those are dumped to a lot of a lot of different sources that you can kind of navigate to on a daily basis and perform checks around like legitimacy of that URL or not, right? So that takes attackers a little bit of time to kind of catch up. Like, hey, our URL is being blocked here, right? This is where, if you remember, like dynamic DNS coming into play like 8-9 years ago, and people rotating IPs at a faster rate, incorporating that into like their C2, their command and control infrastructure. So what you're seeing from a phishing perspective is individuals using generative AI to create phishing campaigns that are way more realistic than most people have capabilities to really create, whether you're like, script kiddie level or just, the modern day attacker who's doing this from 9 to 5 for, to feed your family. I'm not saying that's right, but that's, some of them do this, right? Like, it's just, this is how they make their money. This is how they take care of their family, where it's nation state. So from a perspective, keep in mind it's text-based, right? So you can speak into it and state things like, I need to create a template for company notifications, resetting, your user badge, right? If you need to sign up to bring your security badge to the security team so we can reset it because we have new control towers or we have new turntables, things you walk through at work, right? You can speak to it and have it create that realistic template, right? And the first iteration may not look like what you need. And now you can state, well, I need one for English speaking, Americans, right? So I need a template of pronouncing the need of individuals to come to security, turn in their key cards so we can swap them out. I need this in English format. Great. Or maybe you're targeting a company in Latin America. I need this in Spanish format, right? So you can have it go ahead and create different templates at a much faster rate than you can do sitting there typing it out, right? And then at the same time, when you start to notice, what attackers start to notice is, okay, well, I'm being blocked all of a sudden now, right? So they must have caught on to the URL or they've caught on to certain keywords. A lot of the email protection, cybersecurity tools are sometimes text-based. They look at certain words, certain terms being leveraged, within the email content, the body of the email, so they can block it, right? So now attackers can say, yesterday I had, out of 200, I had, 120 get through. What happened to the other 80? Oh, the 80 were actually blocked from a URL perspective. There's a good chance now the different email systems have flagged it. Okay, ChatGPT, we're at 3.5 or 4.0. I need to reformat the previous text that I had and then associate synonyms for the first 100 words, right? It's that simple.
I think that before, when it was breaking up, you were talking about that basically we have these use cases with the SIMs where you have the phishing campaigns that are basically changing rapidly, which makes it difficult for you to catch up. I think you were saying that we see those same types of things when it comes to disinformation and misinformation as it relates to social media, especially as we're coming up on the November elections. So do you think that this is going to impact the way security professionals are able to deal with this? Because we can't get up the hey, this is misinformation things. We're not able to basically keep up with the speed with which it's moving by the time they take down one or say, hey, this is not actually real. Maybe 4 or 5 that are just different versions of the same misinformation are out there. So what is it going to look like from a security perspective from you trying to keep up with that?
Yeah, so that's an awesome question. The answer you may not like. The answer is it's complicated, right? So, for example, a few years ago, I was invited to a session to sit down with the Senate Intelligence Committee that was focusing on disinformation campaigns specifically, right? So it was like there was me and I won't say their names, but there was me and like 3 other people that were in a room. We were sitting down with certain members of Congress and their staffers, right? So we're talking about disinformation campaigns. Here's the challenge, right? So think about things in levels. So you have local level, state level, federal level, right? These are how we select our representatives. These are the people that go on, at the federal and state level, end up going on to, become members of Congress. Some obviously at the local level too, but each one of them run their own different campaigns, right? So we saw this in 2016, we saw a lot of this going on, right? With DNC being hacked, emails being leaked from the Clinton campaign, and specifically with the DNC is what you saw, which kind of flew under the radar because there was so much noise happening because Trump was running. But what you really saw from that DNC hack were really the plans that the DNC had laid out, their kind of playbook in regards to getting certain individuals elected, trying to keep certain individuals from rising in the party, XYZ, right? Like their kind of notes. Each party does this, but this is relative to DNC because the DNC was one that was hacked. So what you saw from that was the Russians use that information and then feed it to the other side, right? So DNC is focused on a local race in Miami and Florida. This is what they want their candidate to do. This is where they want them to appear. This is kind of the talking points they want them to focus on. That goes out the door. Now their opponent has it, right? So when it's time to debate, you're kind of at this standstill. Like everything you're going to say, the other side already knows it, right? Unbeknownst to you, because you don't know no one knew what the DNC had. But what you saw in the aftermath of the Democratic Party losing seats in the Senate was like, hey, basically, how did I lose? You saw a lot of candidates, like it seemed like they knew what I wanted to talk about. They knew my playbook, right? So in regards to defense, it's a bit difficult. Again, from just the political spirit, it's a bit difficult because the campaigns run at different levels. At those different levels, unless it's really federal, that's the only way to kind of get the FBI involved. FBI and government don't really help you out at state and local levels. It's kind of up to you. So if you have a campaign, what I kind of recommend what I said in this specific hearing, and some of the work I've done with other organizations that focus on volunteer work on the political side of things is, take a portion of your finances and find a consultant that can work with you from a cybersecurity perspective, kind of mostly focus on wrapping down or kind of hardening your systems, right? Like whatever content you have, whatever talking point you're focused on, whatever research you have, whatever oppo you may have, again, focus on keeping that in-house, like understanding where you're locking that down, understanding how you can leverage cloud technologies to place information there that you need to serve up, maybe from a web content perspective, but also just from a research side of things, right? We have to get to a point where cybersecurity is essentially baked into candidates' minds on whatever side you're on, but it's baked into their minds in regards to how they run their campaign, right? If disinformation happens, I think the way that they can respond is immediately having a reflective moment available, right? By reflective moment, I mean, they said I was in, Syria hanging out with Assad. Here's me on this date. Here's where I stand, right? Like the ability to rapidly fire up information. And this is how they can use AI too, is one of the things I was telling them. Like, think about all your different talking points, use something like ChatGPT. I am a representative from Miami. I focus on immigration due to economic impact and XYZ, right? XYZ are different areas that you believe in, but you have different talking points that can be generated by AI, right? So you have numerous talking points available that you may use or may not use, right, to counter the disinformation. The thing is recognizing the disinformation as it comes out. Like you said, it comes out at a fire hose speed, especially at the federal level, right? When you start against the presidential side, we're all going to see different things happen. I think with the steps you started to see, specifically from the Biden campaign, I can only speak on that side of it because I kind of know some of the people that are working with that stuff on the Biden campaign side, is the ability to rapidly respond, right? So by the time a video is posted, if they think that it's reached enough audiences within Facebook or within maybe Instagram or TikTok, they throw out a response, right? Like you're starting to see that campaign leverage AI in regards to responses, but also in regards to essentially locking down what their messaging is and correlating that to numerous different audiences, whether that be Black, Latino, Middle America, blue collar, whatever it may be, right? Like this is something I think that they started to implement. Protecting yourself, yes. I mean, when you're at that level of a presidential campaign, they likely have someone on staff that's responsible for cybersecurity. That someone on staff that's responsible for cybersecurity is likely looking out for phishing campaigns. That's probably the top thing that they're worried about, right? Now we switch, flip the light switch. We go over to the professional side, right? Like, what are we doing as cybersecurity professionals to protect organizations? Like I said before, I think it's likely going to be phishing. That's the first step. But I think we have to kind of prepare for more malware on the scene, right? The article that you referenced that I wrote out, in that research, I found a few different hacking tools, and I think I mentioned one specifically, which is XXX GPT. So XXX GPT is essentially a tool that attackers can leverage that's running on ChatGPT 3.0. I think it could be on 3.5. I think it's on 3.0. At least it starts at 3.0. And essentially what it does is fast track some of the actions the attackers may take from an offensive perspective, right? So what are the top things that attackers are looking to do? They're looking to find holes in software, vulnerabilities that they can exploit, right? So you can use XXX GPT to essentially scan source code and look for those vulnerabilities. Now, how does that differ from static, some of the SaaS tools and DAS tools out there? The thing is with XXX, it sounds like porn, so I don't like saying it, but it's not porn. the thing with XXX GPT is that ability to scan source code and then simply create your injection at the identification mark, right? So if you see a specific break or a specific API call that happens, that maybe the private key is exposed, right? Like that the private key is exposed at this particular call to this particular system. Maybe it's the API system that handles payments or user registration. At that particular moment, at that breakpoint, they can go ahead and inject the code and their payload into it, and they don't need to be a sufficient programmer to do this. You can actually have ChatGPT write out Python for you, right? Like you can literally sit there. Again, it's generated, right? It takes words, it takes vocal responses from us. So we could literally state, I need Python code that logs into a Microsoft O365, ask for a password prompt every 2 minutes, right? Like you could have ChatGPT write that out. Now let's flip it. Now that I have the script that can log into Microsoft Office, I also need a part of the program that will scan looking for other systems that will respond to this specific API call. Upon connection, I would like to grab the private key. Once I grab the private key, I need to FTP it or SSH into another box within my command and control systems and leverage those same functions that I just mentioned to log in, right? So now you've gone 1, 2, 3. 3 is where we're actually inside, right? And this is where it poses the biggest problem for us is if attackers can speak prompts to ChatGPT, they can leverage the capabilities to create Python scripts. They can take that capability and inject that into source code that's reviewed much faster than a human can naturally, but find those points, vulnerabilities, and inject into those, and then boom, wrap that into malware, and then send that out via maybe a phishing campaign, or maybe just they understand that this open source tool. We just saw what happened with that backdoor that's been going on for the last 2-3 weeks, right? Like then that's an open source tool that with XYZ, and that's an open source tool that I think it'd be fair to say there's probably a couple 100,000 million users that are already using it, right? I think that's fairly safe to say, right? So what happens at that level when you have attackers just scanning it across GitHub, right? Looking for most popular packages, throwing that into ChatGPT, scanning across it, looking for vulnerabilities, and then injecting their own code into it. To me, again, it comes back down to speed. The rapid speed that they'll be able to do that will drastically increase because you don't really need the skills. You don't need like 8-9 years of being a malware author, right? Like you don't need to be the best reverse engineer in the world to be able to pull these things off. If you just know some of the basics of what you want, you can tell ChatGPT to write that and boom, inject that into open source software, right? And I think that's where, for us on the defensive side, I think you're going to see kind of a ramp in regards to some of the malware that we would maybe triage from, if it's low, medium, high, I would say medium to high, right? Like you're going to see more of those mediums start to pop in. And what does that look like? That looks like anyone or any vendor that's acting in the EDR space, in the SIM space, they're going to have to keep up just as rapidly, right? So as an attackers are leveraging AI to create malware, to create ransomware, the second, if it's identified, which hopefully it is, the second it's identified, these vendors will have to be able to grab some of the indicators from that, some of the TTPs, and then put that back out to their clients and put that out to the world, right? Like I think that's where if I had to rank it, I'd say phishing first, and then kind of fairly mid-level. I'd say like mid-level malware, right? Like if you're looking at it from a set perspective, I'd say mid-level, high-level malware that will become much more rampant, much more easy to use, and much more easy to spread, right? Keep in mind with the phishing campaign, we can change our prompts, we can change what the body is as we rate how successful our campaign is, right? And the same thing happens from the malware side. If we start to see that the malware isn't executing, again, we had 200 systems, 120 we see the malware executing, 80 we don't, right? Like, well, what was the stopping gap in that 80? Oh, wait, I just went to virus total, or I went to malware bay, and I can see that someone actually figured out where the key is, where I'm grabbing the private key. Okay, ChatGPT, move that private key down to line 200 versus line 1 or line 8, and then try to look for like a hash or whatever it may be, right? Like there's certain things that they'll be able to do much faster than the traditional, we found the malware, we got the TTPs and signatures out there, we can block it. Attacker has to go back, maybe take a couple of weeks, a month, rewrite that, and then push it back out in a campaign. Like that weeks to month is going to be days. And this is just O'Shea's mind, again, kind of just from what I've seen, but I think that's going to turn into days where they're able to rewrite malware that's flagged by offensive tools, right? And again, when we say offensive tools, we're thinking of, defensive tools. When we say defensive tools, we're talking about the vendors that are out there that we mostly are putting a bunch of our faith into to protect us, right? And you know who the top four are. I won't go into like who the top four are. We all kind of know who they are in regards to companies buying huge contracts, 4-year contracts with this EDR, this SIM, this WAF, whatever it may be. So those are the kind of the two areas that immediately pop to mind out from a professional side. The disinformation campaigns on the political side, that's one, but those are kind of the two areas I think as defenders we're likely going to encounter. So it raises the question of what do we do from a defensive perspective, right? If you're on the blue team, how do you try to counter this? The first thing I think is, do you have someone dedicated to data engineering, right? So most organizations will have kind of a split, a cyber fusion with split focus. Someone's, monitoring detection, someone is web app, someone's doing program management, someone's doing GRC, right? I think what you'll start to see is companies start to ask, like, who is responsible for data engineering? Like I know for sure, like programs like at Wells Fargo have dedicated departments to AI security, right? Like they literally have a whole department that's dedicated to it. I think what you'll start to see is, one, from a data engineering perspective, is them begin to ask questions, or what I think should happen is us asking questions around, can we categorize and identify the data within our environment first, right? First things first, do we know what we have? Do we understand what are our log sources? Can we quantify those, and can we break those down into critical versus like non-critical? This is one of the things I do from the consultancy side, when I work with clients pre and post breach, is hey, well, tell me what your data is. What does it look like? Where is it stored? How have you tagged it? Let me know what that looks like first. And sometimes they can answer, and sometimes they can't. I think if you want to be able to fight against AI, you have to remove that can't. Like that has to be gone. You need someone focusing on the data engineering aspect that can map out critical assets versus non-critical. What log sources do we need, not only from endpoints, but also from our cloud assets? What API logs are available, right? What logs from the web server are available? And begin to kind of weave those into some type of correlation engine, or at least a data warehouse where you can quickly pull from those. Once you have, the capability of, from a data engineering perspective, of warehousing or mapping out all of your sources, you'll have to look at ways to integrate those to create better detection capabilities, right? So what does that look like now, right? A lot of what I see is most of us, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I think it's the right path to take, in my mind, but I could be wrong. But I'm often wrong, according to my wife. So I think what you what you'll see is, I mean, what you see now is all of that information dumped into a SIM, right? All those different log sources pouring into a SIM that I just mentioned, and us creating detection capabilities primarily from a vendor first, whatever rule sets they have out of the box that we have, and then from our own cybersecurity minds and cybersecurity skill sets, whoever you have responsible for detection and response or security monitoring, using their knowledge to create different forms of detection capabilities that are only primarily relevant to your environment. So the way I summarize that is, when you look at MITRE attack techniques, are you looking at all of MITRE, or are you looking at the tactics and techniques that are relevant to your environment? Because everything in MITRE isn't relevant relative to what you're doing, right? Like I hate when people do that. I hate to say hate, but I really don't like that mindset like we've come into of like, I need a heat map. I need to know that we're covered against everything on MITRE. And it's like, dude, you don't need that. You need to focus on your tech stack and which relevant techniques are applicable to you, right? Along those same lines, when we have all of our data in a warehouse, we've identified all of our data, we have to start getting creative with how we actually correlate information and data to create detection capabilities. So something I've been toying with is taking what we know from data fabric and data pipelines. Data fabric basically being pretty much the technologies that we use to interweave numerous log sources from numerous different tools, right? Like the Palo Alto WAF product you may have, and the FireEye Mandiant EDR you may have different log formats that they use for alerting. So how do you make those two speak to each other, or have an output from those two that is singularly focused that your team understands from an alerting and response perspective, right? So what you would have to kind of look at, and what I've been looking at, is essentially, hey, well, I know I have these API logs, I know I have these web logs, I know I have these endpoint logs, and I have these specific asset logs from EC2 instances. How do I actually create something that can identify a tweak from the baseline of this specific server that handles these specific API calls? I should see this level of 200s, maybe a couple 400s, but I shouldn't see a huge amount of redirects, right? So when that redirect happens, where is that redirect call coming from? If a redirect call is coming from an external source that we know isn't relative to our operations, cool. What is the normal packet size of that I can feed into my WAF? What content is available within the headers? If there's certain content that I think is normally outside of our business operations, what information went out the window, but also what also is running from an EDR perspective on that machine, right? You're likely not going to see an alert because it's just likely specially crafted. So you have to kind of look at, from an EDR perspective, we saw this call to the registry, or we saw this temp profile created, whatever it may be, and begin to kind of normalize layers of different data approaches, right? So we saw this from the WAF side, we saw this from the EDR side, and we saw this from an API logging perspective. Where is the baseline drifting for us, right? Like, you have to be able to kind of create these things on your own. And this is where I think AI can come into play. I think this is where you will start to see a lot of the vendor tools start to shift, right? Like, most of the tools out there, like you saw, if you keep up with the VC world and cybersecurity, like I do, like I'm not obsessed with it, but I like to know like what companies are being funded. The biggest space that we've seen in Q1 and Q2 of this year have been companies that focus on data fabric, right? These are companies that act as the interlocking agent between different components that you may, different vendor products you may purchase, and correlating that data so it can be fed into like a SIM, right? Like, this doesn't happen by magic, right? You need something that can correlate different log formats, different alert content, and have an output that's understood, that you can understand on your team. And where you've seen a lot of the investment going over the Q1 and Q2 have been the data fabric, companies. So what you'll likely start to see from a vendor side is the capability to rapidly create detections, right? Using AI, probably generative AI from a text-based perspective, like being able to give it simple prompts like, hey, how many redirect attempts that we see at this API endpoint? And relative to the asset, the EDR agent, did we see any specific calls to the bin drive? I mean, the bin folders, right? Did we see anything relative to scripts being created to auto run at startup or at the beginning at startup for an agent or that specific Linux server, right? Like they'll start to think a bit more broader in regards to their detection capabilities that aren't signature related, right? So you can obviously you'll still get your rule sets and everything that's going to come out of the box, but the capability to rapidly look at many log sources available within your environment and create detection capabilities in a much faster rate is likely where AI will become a player for us on the defensive side. This is just O'Shea's opinion. I could be wrong, but this is kind of what, based on my research and kind of things I know, this is kind of where I'm starting to see things kind of shift. If that answers the question, I know that was very long and drawn out, but
no, I get you, but it sounded like a lot of what you were saying is not necessarily the current state, but maybe the future state of what it could be at some point. So my question is like, what does the learning curve look like? I mean, and I guess I'd like answers twofold. One from a cybersecurity training perspective for defenders or future defenders, and then two from a capability standpoint within like the LLMs or the AI applications. You know what I'm saying? Like, what does that look like for us? Figuring out what's the data requirements. What does that learning curve look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first one, right? Again, this is O'Shea's opinion. I'm trying to be like, I'm going to answer this from like a kind of agnostic perspective. I think you're going to have to take this upon yourself, number one, to kind of start to learn this, which I suggest start learning now, right? Like you see, ISC Squared has courses out there for learning the basics of AI and how that may be applicable to security. Google has a couple courses. I know Harvard has some free courses. I want to say Dartmouth. It's either Dartmouth or Carnegie Mellon has some courses on this too that are basically free. What I recommend to individuals is looking to find resources where you can begin to learn about AI. Don't put on the security hat first. Just what can I learn about AI, and then take those basics. Maybe look to a degree. Like I dropped out of school. Like I said, I'm actually trying to go back specifically for data engineering and AI. There's a couple of schools that are on my finals list, but begin to upskill yourself. Number one, in your free time. I think a lot of us, we're dedicated to this. We're passionate. We want to learn as much as we can. You have to apply that to the AI aspect. So look into free courses and then moving into paid courses, and keeping current with resources, right? I think that's kind of the first step. I'm pretty sure there's numerous other resources out there for learning AI. I just kind of know what I've seen and what I've done for myself. And that's kind of the steps I've taken. So the second question in regards to LLMs, and I would say kind of learning about that and how can you get kind of that hands-on experience, right? This is where I think I'll break it into two parts. If you can't do this at work, this is something you can do at home, right? So you can build out an environment that's cloud-based, has a web server, has other has other agents. You deploy, something like Elasticsearch or the Elastic SIEM or Elastic Linux EDR agents. I don't work for Elastic. These are just things I use because they're open source. So you deploy things like that within your environment, so you kind of replicate what an organization would do from a security perspective. The key things here that you want to take away from before you start going to LLMs, again, this comes back to the data engineering aspect. Do you have the capability to quickly resolve, pull, identify log sources that are critical to you? Do you have a way to kind of interweave those to pull out and create context relative to security applications? Security applications meaning, can you detect the XYZ types of attacks? Web attacks, endpoint attacks? Can you start to look at tactics and techniques from persistence to evasion on those assets based upon the log sources that you're able to pull? Again, we can just talk about Linux endpoint, right? There's so many different log sources, or a Windows endpoint. There's so many different log sources available to help you identify, suspicious behavior or attacker techniques. Great. You know what Windows log sources and Linux log sources you need. Now let's look at that from maybe a WAF perspective. Now let's look at that from an API perspective, right? So how do I find a way to correlate all these different log sources so they make sense? First, for you as a person, you understand what the data engineering actually is produced for you. Now we can talk about feeding that into an LLM, right? And from an LLM perspective, what I've been kind of focusing on is like, how can I create tags for different data sources? So a quick example, and hopefully this isn't too like convoluted or whatever, because I'm trying not to be. A quick example is I have Linux agents that are running in a cloud environment. There's certain folders like SSH, certain bin folders, anything relative to auto start, any scripts that I may see that may pop up on the machine. There's certain logs and folders that I want to ensure that I'm monitoring from my side, right? And that has a classification of like 1 through 3 from an importance perspective, 3 being the highest, right? So I tag that as a 3 Linux, L3 Linux, right? Then I look at it from an API perspective, right? I have an endpoint that's running that I'm using to transmit whatever type of data. This data has its own classification as 1 through 3 for the endpoint. And then I look at it from alerts from maybe like AWS WAF, same thing, high severity, low. We have those. Now, the question is, how do I bring these together to populate into an LLM that helps create detection capabilities? So if I see a specific folder that's a level 2 for me on the Linux agent side, but then I have something from a WAF perspective that's a 3 because it's drift outside of what I normally see from the API logs. I'm seeing redirects. I'm seeing a certain amount of failures click in. When 2, 3, and 2 connect, that produces a grade or a scoring that I know is something I need to look into, right? How do I actually do this from the LLM perspective of creating these different types of tags? You could almost say asset tagging, but creating these type of tags or scoring system that allow me to create detection capabilities outside of what the vendor has, right? So using LLMs, you can take that data, pop it into an LLM, and then start to use AI to run more computations around how much drift do I see from our API perspective. Now that I know what the drift is from the API perspective, when do I see folder paths or folders change on the endpoint? Great. Now that I see folders and endpoints change, give me recent 30, 90 days of the attacks we've seen at the WAP, so you can start to identify potential success rates for the attackers. And they're not always going to get it on the first try, but you give them 90 days to bang against your system, there's a good chance they're going to get in at some point. And you can start putting that all together with like generative AI to have output that's like, hey, here's the detection capabilities you may want to focus on, right? Like that's kind of the way, again, O'Shea's mind, I can be off the wall sometimes, but I kind of see you thinking about, I think you have to have that type of mindset, right? Like you have to have the mindset of, you have to figure this out first, right? Within your environment. You can't depend on vendors to sort this out for you, because each vendor will have their own approach to how they leverage AI for security. So I think you as a security practitioner have to begin to think about, again, you know your environment better than the vendor will, right? Or you should. First step data engineering before you can go into LLMs. You should know your environment better than anyone else, right? So the first thing I kind of think about is being imaginative and looking at where we think we're vulnerable, what are our critical assets, and what do we think within our environment is exploitable from a tactics and techniques perspective. Now we can apply that to our data engineering and come up with whatever detection capabilities or however our imagination takes us there, right? I think that's kind of the approach that you'll start to see security professionals take. I think you'll start to see teams focus on data engineering, and then the teams will eventually focus on having at least one source dedicated to AI security, right? And that's what I see happening, and it's 2024. I think by 2026, it'll be normal to have someone on the security team for data engineering and someone for AI. So hopefully that answers your question.
So, a lot of times when we're talking about AI, folks are saying that, AI is going to end up taking a lot of people's jobs, right? But what it
Oh, well,
sounds like, no, and I agree. But I think that those jobs that they're going to end up taking are going to be the low level, like highly repeatable, automatable level of things. But, in my mind, if they don't exist now, the AI engineering team is obviously going to need to be, hired to be able to do the things that you're talking about, right? That's not something that exists I think largely in the job market today, right? What's going to have to happen is that you have folks that understand, what's being done by the AI, and then, basically how the humans interface with that, software or application or whatever, to be able to take whatever steps are necessary. Because like you said, this is not like something that usually works out of the box. It takes understanding what your own assets are. It takes understanding, where the things are that you care about, and what normal looks like in your environment. You know what I'm saying? When you're setting up that level 1, 2, and 3, you have to know what's levels 1, 2, and 3, right? And if the AI can't necessarily say, well, hey, this is a level 2, we know off of the break that anything that's a level 2 or a level 3, we probably need to take a look at. There needs to be a set of eyes that takes a look at it.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
I think that they're, when we're talking about a learning curve, in my mind, yes, it's going to probably, replace quite a few number of jobs, but then also there's going to be this, higher level of knowledge that's necessary, at whatever that demarcation point is, from where the AI stops off and then humans have to basically take over. Because again, like with the speed with which things are changing, from a defensive perspective, I think that there will always be something that, humans need to take a look at, right? Because I think at this point in life, AI is not great at 0 days. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't want to be like, AIs cannot do anything about 0 days, but I'm saying it's not great. You know what I'm saying? So as we get better, and I think you talked about some of those approaches from a defensive capabilities perspective, some of those approaches on how we get better at analyzing what that looks like at the different layers. But we're not there yet. You know what I'm saying? And
No.
AI has to be trained. So realistically, someone's going to have to, one, know that, and then two, be able to document it enough that it can be, developed and trained, in order for us to get to the future state that you're basically talking about.
Yeah, and that, I think that's another thing people don't they don't totally focus on is the data. AI is only as good as the data you feed it, right? It takes a lot of processing power and a lot of resources to build out some of these models, right? So your AWS bill or GCP bill is about to go through the roof when you're doing this stuff internally, right? So that's one thing to think about is it's if you want to use a paid version of ChatGPT to build out security capabilities, that's not going to work, right? Because it's going to require so much input, so much data that you're going to want to host that internally, right? So this is why I mentioned, there's likely going to be someone dedicated to AI. And I think another area that outside of, the ability to feed it in, the data that it needs in regards to like, processing power. But what you mentioned along the lines of jobs being, eliminated, I think that's a lot of fear that we're seeing right now. Like if you're on LinkedIn or if you're on Wired, certain publications, you've seen this question arise, will AI eliminate certain software engineering jobs? I don't think so. I think, again, this is where my view kind of twists from some of my peers. I think it will create more jobs than it eliminates in the technology field. This is just what I see. I think you'll see more individuals having to upskill or come in the door with certain knowledge and skills that they don't have now. But that was the same 10 years ago, right? The level of software engineers we have now coming out of college have a bit more knowledge and skills from the guys that were or ladies that were coming out 10, 15 years ago, because education grows on previous establishments, publications, and information, right? We keep leveling up, right? So I think what you'll start to see is, I'm speaking from a technology side, right? But from a technology side, I think you'll see more jobs actually being created because, yeah, like you said, you still need that human interface of, I know what this client is likely going to leverage from the web page. I know how their buying habits may work. AI can feed me that, but I know from their visual perspective what they likely will click on based on the web design of the page, right? I know from a cybersecurity perspective that these type of attacks are more prevalent than XYZ attacks for our environment. So I know what to feed it in the AI, right? I think the skills thing, the skills gap is where we are kind of right now. Knowledge and skills gap, kind of like what we're talking about this whole conversation, is that knowledge and skills gap that exists right now. I think you'll see that shift into more basics of understanding what your job may be in different fields of technology. Like we know AI is currently being used from a pharmaceutical perspective, right? Like I think it was, I want to say Pfizer just bought, became a massive client of OpenAI in regards to creating a environment where they can speed along medical trials. You know, they have patents for medication. You know, there's data sciences that they've been relying upon. This isn't just Pfizer. This is most pharmaceuticals. Don't quote me on Pfizer, but I think it's Pfizer. These are most pharmaceutical companies that have, you know, loads of ideas and patents for different medicine, but they have to go through clinical trials. They have to look at different types of data sets to determine where they need to tweak it, where they need to maybe add a different ingredient, a new component, whatever it may be, right? I think you'll start, like what you've already started to see is data scientists leveraging AI to quicken or shorten clinical trials, right? You've seen AI being leveraged across law offices, like big law offices, not mom and pop, but big law offices in regards to reading through research or past cases that have already had judgment on them, right? So basically, some of the things a law clerk would do, you've seen AI already start to do that, right? So does that mean law clerks aren't going to be available anymore? No, of course not. It just means their focus will likely shift more to like how can they prosecute or how do they defend. You know, they're going to move to a higher level being able to assist, you know, the head attorney or lead attorney, right? The areas where I do see it eliminating jobs, you know, and I think, you know, this is a whole other podcast, but I think if I'm looking at it from a societal perspective, I do see certain areas that affect us, like people of color, anything that's relative to kind of like service management, like warehousing jobs, right? If you have a side hustle with like Uber, you know, with AI being integrated into autonomous vehicles, I think you're going to see more and more shifts of individuals being comfortable. I think in California right now, I know in San Francisco because I was there and I did it. You know, you could
I
hop
saw it
into.
too.
Yeah, I mean, I rode in a fully autonomous ride share. Nobody in the car, just picked me up, and then we went, dropped me down in Financial District, and then he left. Right, so you know, I think it's mostly on the West Coast right now. You'll start to see things like that, you know, build and spread. So you know, a certain amount of jobs that we would associate with not having higher levels of education or not having technical skills. I think those are the things we'll start to see kind of drop off. Like I know in Nevada, I can't recall the company. There's a trucking company, and they're one of the first to kind of push out autonomous 18-wheelers. Right, there's still a human there because Department of Transportation requires that the humans actually in the cab in the truck, but they can drive up and down the highway on their own. The area that they're struggling in right now is just cities. The 18-wheelers are having problems kind of switching lanes in cities and navigating traffic, which I believe this specific company is fairly close to figuring out, right? And once they get that stamp of approval from Department of Transportation, now, you know, they can move away from Nevada. Nevada is the only state that allows you to have autonomous vehicles for testing on their roads, right? It's the only state in the country that, so anytime Tesla or whoever it is wants to test their rides, they go to Nevada. That's where all that stuff happens. So once DOT stamps that approval, you'll start to see more states take that on, right? So what does that mean for people? A lot of truck drivers are going to be, you know, fighting for jobs, you know, most likely. We've already seen what AI can do from Amazon in regards to warehousing, in regards to, you know, packaging and smaller robots that are able to pick up pallets, move, stack it somewhere, and they can run the warehouse in the complete dark, you know, 24 hours a day, right? These are jobs that you typically look at, you know, without having a degree or having technical skills that you can kind of easily obtain. I think, unfortunately, because I don't know what the answer looks like for this, I think that's kind of the scary thing to me is like, what happens when you see a societal shift for individuals that don't have advanced knowledge and tech capabilities in a country where universities are expensive and maybe not attainable. and their jobs start to slowly be taken away from them. The capabilities are gone, right? What does that look like from a societal perspective? We already have a pretty huge disparaging wealth gap right now. What happens when people on the bottom aren't able to find, the work that they become accustomed to? I think that's kind of what's scary to me. Like, I don't think about the Skynet stuff. I look at it from a societal perspective of like, that's where problems can really start to arise, right? We know socioeconomic conditions. The formula is fairly simple that leads to crime, right? Lack of opportunity, lack of education, good chance you're going to fall within the criminal bracket, right? Unfortunately, right? So what happens when you have a massive portion of your population, what the median income is 40,000 in this country, right? So what happens when that median income drops from 40 to, 30, 25, 35, something along those lines, right? When those opportunities start to shrink, and we don't have the ability to upskill and give everyone the knowledge to become cybersecurity professionals. That's why I love doing nonprofit work. I try to work with nonprofits that are focused on other individuals that, maybe don't have the traditional path to resources that everyone else has. That's why I love what you do too. I think that's where I don't know have the answer. I don't know. I think that's where that big gap is what are we going to do about it now? Because I think now is kind of the point where we have to find a way to educate individuals, not just on AI, but technology in general, right? For what the last 10 years, 15 years, we've been saying, if you don't understand technology, it's going to be harder to get a job. That has turned out to be true. People even people getting a business degree have to take at least one computer science class, right? But what happens, so what happens when a lot of the jobs are technology based, and then you start baking in things like AI or LLMs that you need to understand. I know people that I have two close people there in my life that are biologists, right? And they've had to take extra courses after school. They got their degree. They've been working for a while. They've had to kind of go back and upskill themselves on data science and data engineering just to be able to keep up with what they're doing on the scientific side of things, right? So you already see this. So like, what is the answer? I have no idea, but I think we have to come up with something.
No, I agree with you completely. I think that what we're going to see is that what entry level looks like is going to increase in terms of the level of technology and cybersecurity knowledge necessary to be entry level, because I think that in my mind, what the future of the workforce is going to look like is that, a lot of the repeatable tasks, a lot of the low hanging, a lot of the things that I can actually give you step-by-step instructions on what needs to be done, a lot of those low hanging things where it was just like, oh, maybe we can't necessarily find people to do them, or who want to necessarily do them because they're not glorious and glamorous things. A lot of those types of things are going to be taken over by AI. I saw on I think X yesterday that they have like little machines that basically in the hospitals, they go bathroom to bathroom and they clean it, and they have robots basically go into each one of the bathrooms, clean them. And then, what I'm saying? So that's probably eliminated, for example, some of the janitor jobs, right? And I think when we look in the technology sector, what we're going to end up seeing is that as we have, basically the lower level jobs that are basically being taken over by automated systems, which maybe have an additional high cost to create, but once they're actually created, the implementation is probably going to remove the need for a lot of some of those low level people. I think that we're going to need more knowledge to be able to get into what was previously considered entry level jobs, where maybe you actually do need a CISSP for an entry level job. That's what we see now, which is complete, I think,
crazy
trash. Absolutely. I think it's complete trash. But I mean, at some point, the level that you're going to need to understand, especially when you look at things like, for me, penetration testing, for example, the level of what you need to know is going to be higher. The bar is going to be raised just based off of the fact that a lot of the low hanging fruit. But again, we're talking about, a demarcation point, what I'm saying, establishing what that demarcation point is going to look like, where AI capabilities end and humans basically are going to be able to pick up from that point. So I think that's going to be interesting in terms of looking at, as you were mentioning, like the societal impact of, what AI has the potential to bring to the industry.
Yeah, and you said something earlier around like, AI being able, from a cyber perspective, AI being able to, perform like basic OSNet tasks, right? Like scan websites, perform a bit of research, right? That's just like, we're at that stage now. But then what
We
happens
are.
when it's, yeah, and it's like, what happens when it starts performing those SQL injections, right? What happens when I mean, there was another tool that I was in my research I found that was more. It was I didn't write about it because I didn't see the difference between that and a lot of the DDoS purchase services you can purchase, But it was a tool kind of similar to XXS GBT where you could leverage it for DDoS attacks, but you could feed it a range. I think what they were going for is you can feed it a range of clients to kind of tailor your DDoS attack, right? So, for instance, I know I'm targeting a grocery store in this specific city or town. There's only three options available. So I target A. Once I hit flood A with whatever amount of traffic, I can knock their online servicing or online ordering offline. Then target B, and then only leave C up, right? So C is the one who's purchased the service, right? So it's kind of able to knock out its competition. But the AI, if I read the instructions right, I didn't buy it. I was looking at it, but if I read it right, it was its ability to kind of shift your target spectrum. You can shift it in real time, adjust traffic, but also you could scan for vulnerabilities against all the subdomains of the website, right? But from what I read, they couldn't inject. They couldn't actually act on it. They could just scan and kind of give a report. And I think what'll be scary, and I try not to think about it too much because I feel my best friend says I'm like delusionally optimistic, right? That's how he describes me. So I think there's always going to be a way to catch up and fix it, But I think what we'll see in the next year or two is probably those capabilities of scanning websites and looking for vulnerabilities and then reporting back, at a much faster rate. What happens when someone starts applying that? You remember when you did network scanning, right? We were younger. The big thing was how much of the, at least for me, how much of the earth can I apply and scan networks for, right? Like how many networks can I scan, and dump into Wireshark, right? That was like a weird thing I used to do. Like I scan, 20,000 websites in Argentina this week, just letting it go off and scan, letting it map do its own thing, right? What happens when someone's able to apply that at scale with AI, where they're scanning hundreds of thousands of IP addresses? They're able to probe for vulnerabilities. When they find vulnerabilities, they're able to perform the first layer of attack to actually gain initial access. They're pulling that information back, dumping that on the dark web, dumping creds on the dark web, or they decide to go further, right? Like I don't. It sounds crazy because you're saying like 10,000, 100,000 websites, but I think that's totally possible within a couple of years. I totally see that. I can see that happening.
I don't even think it's going to take a couple of years. I've actually been playing with the tool that can basically take you from, zero to low level access, basically a low level user access that's able to get in. I've actually seen it do like get to root, where it's just basically looking for commands through an LLM that they can submit, and then finding vulnerabilities and then exploiting the low level ones until they get root access. And once they've gotten root so this is I've actually practiced with this on vulnerable machines, but realistically I don't think that we're at this point 2 years out from basically automating that entire process so that it doesn't necessarily even require a human. You know what I'm saying? And then that's why I think that it's going to be that you're going to require your penetration testers, your threat hunters, all of your folks that are looking at vulnerabilities or who care about the vulnerabilities. They're going to be basically tasked with the higher level things that can't necessarily, that are moving targets per se, what I'm saying, that we don't have the signatures for it, that we don't have, what I'm saying, but a lot of the low level, like, hey, do the scanning, enumeration, get the low level user, see if you can escalate privileges. A lot of those we have tools for that can do those things today. What I'm saying? So I don't think that it would be a large lift for us to be able to basically get that on at scale. So
yeah, you have to share that tool with me so I can go look at it. But I mean, this actually goes back to what I was saying earlier around like, as defenders, we'll have to find a way to incorporate data engineering first, then get to AI, but we'll have to start thinking a bit broader in regards to our detection capabilities. I think it's for me, I don't enjoy being at the mercy of a vendor, right? I've had arguments with certain vendors, I won't say their names, over the last couple of years in regards to how fast they're releasing detection signatures, right? How fast they're releasing TTPs, right? Like, hey, I'm in different Intel sharing groups, right? So I know someone in this specific Intel sharing group I'm in is telling me that, signatures are available through this specific vendor. Then I go to the vendor and I'm like, hey, I don't see this available. Then they're like, oh, you got to buy this specific package. You're not in this package for your client. I'm like, it's just, I get it. They got to make money. I totally understand that. But, you're basically being held hostage at that point, right? Like, I don't enjoy that feeling of helplessness. And I've been in that feeling of helplessness during an incident, and that's the worst time when you're asking a vendor, hey, we have these indicators. Can you help us try to figure out if there's something else we should be looking for? And they're like, yeah, I think there is, but you're not in this platinum package. You're in the gold package, Like, I don't want to be in that position when it comes to leveraging like AI down the line. I want to be able to, like, I don't think it sounds stupid. I don't think I'm like that smart when it comes to cyber. Like, I don't look at myself as someone that's like, whatever, smartest or greatest person in cyber, right? Like, I look at myself as more like a creative person. Like, I'm fairly creative, again, delusionally optimistic, right? So I have crazy ideas. Lucky for me, sometimes it works. I've been able to build a good career out of it, right? But I think I think that's where you're going to have to be, is in regards to thinking a bit broader in regards to your detection capabilities, not relying on a vendor, understanding, again, data engineering, understanding your sources and how you can leverage those. That's where if I had to summarize where I think it's going from a cyber defense perspective, I think that's where it's likely going to be, right? Being able to rapidly respond to phishing, being able to quickly, let's say there is a phishing attempt, right? And that maybe it slipped through once and we're able to create detection capabilities, right? Now, can I amplify that and look across all aspects of endpoints within my environment to look for anything that could be another previous version of that phishing attempt? Because my mind goes to, this one got through, but is this the first, second, third attempt from them, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I've been saying this for years. Right. Like, you caught that one, but how do you know there's many more you didn't catch, right? And the only way to really know that is look at the malware that they have associated with it, right? Like, you have to start looking at certain aspects of the malware, pulling out artifacts, and then tweaking those. Like, what would he have done or she have done? What would this attacker have done earlier, previously? Like, that's the way I think, and luckily it kind of serves me well. But I think that's the way, again, it's going to work from the defensive perspective with AI, is looking at what can I do to create detection capabilities that my vendor can't or will do, but I have to pay for it, right? But what do I know that about my environment, about what's exploitable, about what's critical, that I can use AI to create models to detect? I think that's where, if I have to summarize it all, I think that's where it's going. The problem gap area is us gaining the knowledge, the skills. Do you have the capability to test this out inside of your organization? Because some people have their 9 to 5, it's 9 to 5, right? Like, their day is kind of mapped out and they don't have room to explore. They don't have room to perform research, right? So what do you do if you don't have, that capability at work? Like, you got to rely on yourself to figure this stuff out. But this is why I said I think you'll likely see people dedicated to these roles fairly, well, I'd say within 2 years, you're going to see people dedicated to those roles. But again, not to sound repetitive, I think it's on us as individuals, because this could be a market where you can jump up fairly quickly, right? Like, if you understand AI,
get in the gym.
It's 2024. What was it, May, right? April 2024. If you spend a year learning about this, by the time 2025 comes around, April 2025, you're pretty much miles ahead of people, right? Like, if you can understand the basics and you can start creating models at home, that's what I've done. I'm speaking from personal experience, being able to create models, leverage ChatGPT to help me out, help me do some things. I've created metrics for incident response within ChatGPT, within 3.5. Like, I think this is something that it's something I can pitch in interviews. Like, hey, well, have you thought about this, right? Like, have you thought about doing this? And there's different things you can do to sell yourself, and I think that's kind of, especially with people of color, like I think a lot of us, in order to stand out in the field, not saying you have to, do whatever, but I think when you think about that next area that to gain edge, I think this is where you can gain edge and you can really start to have an impact on an environment, and not just from a technical perspective. Think about if you understand this from a security program perspective, like you start asking questions like, hey, GRC, why aren't we using AI to ensure that we're meeting compliance for SOC 2 when I know that the security and monitoring and detection team has this level of output from their metrics? Why aren't we using this to correlate to SOC 2 requirements in real time on the fly? So whenever we start to drift out of compliance, we see that versus waiting for monthly reports. Like if you can do that at a higher level, what does that mean for you career wise? Right? Like that's the way I kind of approach things, right? It's like,
Right.
It's always level. It's level 1, level 2, technical, level 3. Can I do it for a practice? Level 3, can I do it for a 4? Can I do it for a program? And that's, I think if you have that mindset right now, you start learning this stuff, you could be pretty far in your career, by next year, just because you're at the edge. You're the person that they can turn to start asking, like, hey, we want to build this function of AI, how do we do it? And you have an answer for it. Maybe you don't have the whole answer, but you have a part of it. That's better than what 90 something percent of people in InfoSec right now. That's like maybe 10% of people are actually looking at this stuff.
Absolutely. All right. O'Shea, I want to thank you so much for coming out to AI Thoughts Online. Any parting things that you want to drop, anything you're working on, anything you want to promote?
I'll be dropping some research, something I call the real-time cyber apparatus. It's basically a way to correlate detection capabilities to risk, and then have the risk capabilities to potential revenue loss. So I'll be dropping. It's basically, I think, a new approach, a new strategy to security. It's something I started building at a former startup. But what I wanted to do was basically take, hey, here's our detection capabilities. Here's how it correlates to risks correlating to revenue loss. I think that's a big thing us as cyber professionals don't truly understand, is how do we present potential revenue loss from a detection and monitoring side. So that's something I'll be posting in the next 2 months. But that's really the big thing for me. We did make a decision that we will be doing SkiCon 2025 in February. So SkiCon is something I started. I'm in Boston. When I moved to Boston from Sweden, I got to meet people at the DEF CON group, and we were out. I'm a big snowboarder. We were out snowboarding. I briefly mentioned the idea of having, why don't we have something we can ski and snowboard and then have the con, and then by the next meeting, not everyone, I had people asking, like, we hear you're starting a conference, which wasn't what I was saying, but somehow it got turned into that. So I said, screw it, I'll go ahead and go forward. So we've had 2 of them so far. This will be the 3rd one. SkiCon is essentially a conference where we get together, and most likely Loon Mountain in New Hampshire, in Lincoln, New Hampshire. Loon Mountain, Friday night, fireside chats. Saturday morning, get together, meet at the mountain for first runs. We try to split people off into groups. Me and 2 other organizers will likely have some more volunteers. We use walkie-talkies, split people into different runs. So, and it's, even if you don't snowboard or ski, you're more than welcome to come. Well, some people snow tubed last time, so there's some people that don't ski or snowboard. So I think some people snowshoed and some people snow tubed, where you can just hop in that tube and go down the hill. So be on the lookout for more information for SkiCon 2025.
Awesome. All right. Well, like I said, thank you so much, O'Shea, for coming out. This has been another episode of AI Thoughts Online. Thank you guys for listening.